Heavily armed Israeli soldiers have stormed Al Jazeera's Ramallah bureau in the occupied West Bank. Our colleagues were given 10 minutes to gather their belongings and leave. Doors to the office have been welded shut and the military has ordered the bureau to close for 45 days. Now, during the raid, Israeli soldiers tore down a large banner of Shireen Abu Akleh. The veteran Al Jazeera journalist was shot and killed by an Israeli sniper while reporting from Jenin 2 years ago. Fintan Monahan begins our coverage.
Israeli troops moved in before sunrise. Their mission? To silence Al Jazeera's reporting in the occupied West Bank. Many wore masks and were heavily armed. In the hallway, the soldiers confronted Al Jazeera's bureau chief, who carried nothing but a microphone.
This is a decision that was made by one of the Israeli generals. He is ordering us to immediately leave the office and take our personal belongings and cameras. The army says we have only 10 minutes to take our belongings and leave the office so they can shut it down.
The office will be closed for 45 days.
Israeli forces also tore down banners of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. She was killed by Israeli forces in 2022 while reporting in the Jenin refugee camp. Banners like this stood as a reminder of Israel's past attacks on journalism, memories it is now seeking to erase.
Transparently vengeance for Al Jazeera's crime of reporting the truth about what Israel is doing in the occupied Palestinian territories. Israel is carrying out endless atrocities, and nobody has done a better job of reporting on them than Al Jazeera has. And I think this is a transparent effort by Israel to essentially punish Al Jazeera for that crime, and also to ensure that there's even less coverage of that reality and less of it comes out to the rest of the world.
Media rights groups have condemned Israel's restrictions and attacks on journalists. Al Jazeera has been a constant presence in Palestine, giving voice to a people who are rarely heard in the international media. These voices often challenge Israel's narrative, something it appears it is no longer willing to accept.
Their whole strategy in Israel is to produce a narrative about Israel, about Palestinians, about Zionism, about the Arab-Israeli conflict, about terrorism, about all of these issues swirling around the region. And that narrative says that the Israelis are good guys and the Palestinians and the Arabs and Muslims are bad guys, and they're a threat. And this is a narrative that the Israelis have succeeded in disseminating all over the world.
Israel's shutdown of Al Jazeera's bureau in the occupied West Bank follows its expulsion of the network's reporters from Israel a few months ago. As Israel struggles with growing criticism of its war on Gaza, it is now seeking to control what people can see and prevent its critics from being heard. Fintan Monahan, Al Jazeera.
The closure of Al Jazeera's bureau has been widely criticised. The Palestinian Foreign Ministry condemned Israel's storming of Ramallah and the closure of the office. It's calling for the implementation of a UN resolution to end the occupation. The Foreign Press Association expressed concern and is calling on the Israeli government to reconsider its actions. It's warning that restricting foreign reporters and closing news channels is a move away from democratic values. Well, for more on this, Zein Basravi is live for us in Amman because the Israeli government has also banned Al Jazeera from reporting within Israel. Zein, what's the Israeli government actually been saying about this raid and the closure on Al Jazeera's offices in Ramallah? Has it offered any explanation as to why?
Well, no explanation has been given, but it is clear it is because Israel is really struggling to control the narrative. Its own government has said over and over again that it is losing the narrative war, as well it should be after a year of what has been described as ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and genocide. I will read to you a statement made by Israel's communication minister. After much pressure, and as we promised this morning, the security forces raided Al Jazeera's main offices, referring to our bureau in Ramallah, describing us as a mouthpiece for Hamas and Hezbollah. And when he went on to say, we will continue to fight our enemies' channels and ensure the safety of our soldiers. Really, this is straight out of Israel's playbook. Associate the journalists, the storytellers, unfairly with the armed groups on whom we're reporting, accuse unfairly the journalists of incitement. And really all this does is it inhibits our ability to amplify the voice of the Palestinian people, which is something Al Jazeera has been doing all along in a vacuum left behind by most Western and global news outlets. Just as an example, the news story for the last year has been front-loaded on the Western media with the issue of the Israeli captives, so-called hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza. Now, that's about 250 people in total that were taken. A few, like dozens remain. But in comparison, the number of people taken by Israel's military in the occupied West Bank in the last year alone is 11,000. And when you speak to Palestinians on the ground, as we have been doing, they will tell you they see this as an industrial-scale kidnapping of its people by an illegal occupying military force.
And Zein, soldiers, as part of that raid, pulled down a banner of our colleague Shireen Abu Akleh, who was killed by Israeli forces 2 years ago. I mean, this is something they've repeatedly done to a memorial for her in Ramallah as well.
I mean, Shireen was a towering figure in journalism, not just in the Arab world, but very broadly seen as someone who spent her entire career for years amplifying the Palestinian story, amplifying the Palestinian voice. She was a Palestinian Christian woman, an American citizen, gunned down by an Israeli sniper while she was covering an Israeli raid in the Jenin refugee camp. And for years, there's been an investigation, but no conclusion, and no justice for her killing. And even in death, during her funeral, the Israeli military tried to stop her funeral procession. Her coffin was knocked over, and even an image of her now represents an existential threat to Israel because of her powerful storytelling, and indeed, her story in and of itself as well.
And Zein, I know you have spent many years reporting from there. Can you just explain how difficult Israel has made reporting from the occupied territories, especially since October the 7th?
Well, since then, there's been a number of deaths of journalists. At least 5 of our own colleagues have died in the last 2 years, but there's been a number of journalists killed, Palestinian journalists killed in Gaza. A number of them, dozens, have been detained in the occupied West Bank, including journalists, activists, university students. The space in which any conversation can be had in the occupied West Bank, in the Palestinian territories, really anywhere where anyone is talking about Israel, has been becoming more and more constricted. We reported on the closure and the deaths of our colleagues and the deaths of other journalists and the deaths of aid workers and the closure of our offices in Jerusalem. We reported on that from Ramallah. And now we're reporting on the closure of our Ramallah office from Amman. So the space in which you can report is getting tighter and tighter. And what many people have reached out and spoken to our colleagues on the ground about is that they are worried that with the closure of the Ramallah office, that will mean there will be no one to continue telling their stories, and their voice will be silenced even more than it already has been.
Zein, as always, thank you so much, Zein Basravi, for us in Amman. As Zein was explaining there, Israeli forces have repeatedly targeted Al Jazeera journalists. In 2022, soldiers shot and killed Shireen Abu Akleh while she was reporting in Jenin. She was wearing a blue flak jacket, clearly marked with the word press. A UN investigation found Israel used lethal force without justification. And a year earlier, Israeli forces destroyed a tower housing Al Jazeera's office in Gaza. They said Hamas was using the building, but has provided no evidence. And more recently, during the war on Gaza, Israeli forces have killed journalists, including Ismail al-Ghul and Samar Abu Dhaka and their families. OK, well, for more on this, we're joined now by Ofer Cassif, who is a Knesset member from the Hadash party. He joins us from Tel Aviv. Thanks very much for being with us here on Al Jazeera.
Thank you.
Can you just explain why the Israeli army would have done this? What is Israel actually trying to achieve by shutting down our office in Ramallah?
Well, I think this is a clear expression of two maladies that Israel has been suffering from: occupation and fascism. Occupation, obviously, because the occupation forces of Israel can penetrate or invade the Palestinian territories whenever they like, including the so-called Area A, which is, according to the Oslo Accords, supposed to be under full control of the Palestinian Authority. So this is part of the occupation, the very ability and so-called legitimacy of the Israeli occupation forces to enter whenever they like those areas, including Ramallah. The other part is fascism, because this government, as I said time and time again, including, by the way, in the Knesset, that it is a full-fledged fascist government which wants to persecute, it does persecute anyone, including within Israel, including Israeli citizens, let alone Palestinians and foreigners. The government and its branches persecute anyone who raises an alternative voice or dare, as it were, to criticize the government and its crimes.
Yeah, well, just on that, just on that. I mean, has there been any outrage at all within Israel? I mean, is there a fear that democracy is being eroded by this government?
First of all, there is no democracy to erode because there was never a real democracy. I mean, in my view, a state that defines itself as if it belongs only to part of its citizens, and practically, even if not necessarily theoretically, defines itself only as an alien to 20% of its very citizens, it's not exactly a democracy. This is only the tip of the iceberg, but still, it was never fascist to that degree, and obviously it was not so much anti-democratic like it is now. People are persecuted within the state of Israel proper. I'm not talking about the Palestinian occupied territories, let alone the Gaza Strip, which is under a genocidal massacre for almost a year. I'm talking even within Israel proper. This Minister of Communication, a few months ago, offered a bill not to close down totally, but to seriously harm and limit the Haaretz newspaper because it is too critical. And now there's another bill he offers that would allow the government to limit and perhaps close down journalists and newspapers, etc., if they harm, as it were, the national morale.
Okay.
That's unbelievable. So I'm not surprised.
No, but what about its international reputation here? I mean, obviously we've heard many organisations come out and condemn Israel's closure of our office in Ramallah. I mean, it comes just a few days after the UN General Assembly said that Israel must end its unlawful presence in Palestinian territories. I mean, how big a blow is all of this combined to Israel's reputation on the world stage? Or is there no reputation left?
Look, the government of Israel has been pursuing a terrible massacre in Gaza for almost a year. More than 40,000 Palestinians, mostly innocent civilians, children, women, elderly, etc., have been butchered by the policy, because of the policy of the Israeli government. And it doesn't seem that the reputation was so harmed. This is a part of the hypocrisy of the international community led by the United States. I'm very sorry to say that. I'm not saying that because I'm happy or glad about it, because I'm furious about it. I'm angry about it. By the way, it doesn't only, cause a terrible damage, to say the least, to the Palestinian people. It is also, in my view, against the interests of the people who live in Israel. But this government doesn't care not about the well-being and lives of the Palestinians for sure, but neither for the lives and well-being of the Israelis themselves. Look what they do with the hostages. We all know that 90% responsibility for the fate, for the terrible fate of the Israeli hostages, is because Netanyahu and his government don't want to make any kind of a deal and stop this massacre. They don't want to. So what happened today in Ramallah against Al Jazeera, and before against Al Jazeera within Israel proper and in Jerusalem, is just a so-called natural layer of a continuous crime committed by this government.
Okay.
And as some of you said before, this is also part of the Israeli government's will to dictate a false narrative. This is part of it. They don't want anybody to know the truth. They hide the truth,
Okay,
partly
Ofer.
by assaulting the media.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. We really do appreciate them. That is Ofer Cassif, Knesset member for the Hadash party.
Thank you very much.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.